President Trump has said he will impose additional tariffs on Chinese goods, extending all the way to hitting all goods brought in from China if he doesn't get a trade deal by Friday. We spoke earlier today with Tao Wang, UBS Investment Bank chief China economist, about what that could mean for the Chinese economy.
If 25% tariff is imposed on everything, then the additional impact could be more than 1 percentage point. I think Chinese government will then have to step up the stimulus. And even in that case, I think growth may fall below 6%.
We welcome now Ambassador Max Baucus, who served as the U.S. envoy to China, and before that as U.S. Senator from Montana for 6 terms, including as chair of the Senate Finance Committee. He comes to us today from Washington as our conversation in chief. So welcome, Mr. Ambassador. Great to have you back with us.
Thanks, David.
You heard what Tao Wang had to say. From what you know of the Chinese economy, how crippling could it be if, in fact, President Trump followed through on his threat to impose 25% tariffs on all imports?
Well, first, to some degree, China might today be the adult in the room, because after Trump threatened the extra tariffs to go into effect Friday, the Chinese decided to come after all. That is, they decided not to back off, which would undermine the deal, and to come back and talk. Now, China is only going to agree to what it can agree to, just as the U.S. will only agree to what it can agree to. If Trump goes ahead and slaps tariffs on because he's not happy, I agree with the earlier person who said the Chinese economy will take a big hit. China will then engage more stimulus, but you know, the Chinese can endure a lot of pain. I think they can endure pain more easily than can the United States.
And it may well hurt the Chinese economy. At the same time, what are the dynamics for the Chinese in appearing to have caved into the President of the United States? I mean, it's striking, as you say, they're still coming. They're bringing a smaller delegation. But it struck me that President Trump said the deadline's Friday. They said, OK, fine, we'll delay our trip by 1 day and come in on Thursday.
Right. Who knows what's going to happen? And this is also unpredictable. But I tend to think that there will be a deal fairly soon, because there has to be one. Each country depends so much upon the other. President Trump needs a deal fairly soon, as does President Xi. It may extend maybe for a few more days in the next week. But my best guess is that both leaders have to save face. They need a deal, and there's going to be a deal. And my personal view is that the Trump bluster is pretty much that. And the Chinese know that. The Chinese have seen Trump change his mind many times, and so they're just going to come on over and see what they can get together.
At the same time, our reporting in Washington has been that part of the problem right now is that they thought they had an agreement, and then they came back in, the Chinese came back in with language which backed off, and particularly in one respect as to whether the changes, the reforms would be in a statute or a regulation, which we might think is just legal technicalities, but I understand it really matters because it's a lot easier to change a regulation than a statute. Is that consistent with your experience with the Chinese as a negotiating style, that you think you kind of have a deal and then they kind of back off on it?
That's somewhat my experience. You know, it's like all negotiations. It's not over until it's over, and nothing's agreed to till everything's agreed to. I mean, I wouldn't get too worked up over whether the Chinese backed off a little bit. The bottom line question is, what can the U.S. agree to and not agree to, as with the Chinese? Now, this distinction between statutes and regulations, I think, is not that significant, because even if the changes that we're talking about are in Chinese statutes, you know, that still is going to be interpreted by the regulators, and ultimately, when push comes to shove, by the party. The Chinese legislation is not nearly as rigid or as controlling as legislation is in the United States. So I wouldn't get too concerned whether it's regulations or statute. Statute helps, but it's not going to be controlling.
Ambassador, you've said before, you've told me before, that you think there is need, not just room, but need for real reform in some of the way the Chinese deal with us in terms of trade, in terms of technology, in terms of intellectual property. Do you think the president's headed basically in the right direction? Whether you like particular statements or particular tweets, is he basically moving toward getting the job done?
I think he's moving in the right direction. He's certainly pushed more strongly than his predecessors. And I think he'll therefore get a little more, but not much more, because China is China. China wants to save face. China is only going to do what it feels it can do. China is very proud. They're there's a strong nationalistic trend in China. China thinks the wind's at their back. They got bounce in their feet. Their destiny is coming. So they're a proud people, and they can withstand a lot of pain, and they're going to keep moving. But they do want an agreement with the United States because that's going to help them with their economic growth.
As you know so well, China's not the only trade issue that's on the national agenda right now. Let's talk about North America, and particularly the USMCA, that successor agreement to NAFTA. It took a long time to get negotiated, and now it seems to be taking a long time to get through the Congress. Where does it stand right now, and what are the chances that it will, in fact, get ratified?
I think it's similar to the China trade negotiations. After a lot of to and fro and lots of blustering, it'll finally get ratified. In the Senate, the question is these Section 232 tariffs, allegedly based on national security. Frankly, I think that's inaccurate. There's no national security worry about aluminum and steel with respect to Canada. So we need that to be eliminated, those 232 tariffs, so that the Senate can move on. In the House, it's with a Democratic-controlled House, a little more concern over there about labor, environmental issues, et cetera. But in my experience in putting trade deals together, they finally come together, but it takes a lot of work, vote by vote, vote by vote. And I think that's what's going to happen this year.
And can it get done this year? Because 2020, as I recall, is an election year, which makes it a little more complicated in Washington from my experience.
Well, not only that, because under trade law, the House has to trigger this fancy legislation called fast track, and then the vote's 90 days afterwards. So, the clock's kind of ticking. It may not get done this year. I hope it does, but it might get in next year. But, election year is cut two ways. Sometimes they want to get results. Sometimes they're worried about let perfection be the enemy of the good. So it cuts both ways. Okay,
so let's talk about 2020 just for a little bit. Get your initial thoughts. We have, I think, 22 candidates now from the Democratic side right now. We're a long way away from it. At the same time, one of the issues that's really come up is age, frankly. We had Howard Dean on our program, and he said, look, we shouldn't have anybody that's over the age of 50 running for president on the Democratic side. Is that relevant as we look at a Joe Biden, as we look at a Bernie Sanders?
It's the people who decide. It's the voters who decide whether age is important and to what degree it's important. And some older candidates are different than other older candidates. It really comes down to the candidate. I frankly sense that a lot of voters are kind of tired of all that's going on in Washington. They kind of want maybe somebody to get elected, if it's not President Trump, could kind of start getting things back together again a little bit. Now, the split in the Democratic Party, of course, is the progressives on one side, and you got the more moderates on the other. But if you look at the polls, they tend to indicate that Democratic voters are voting a little more toward getting stuff done rather than voting according to ideology.
Well, that's interesting. So that would suggest if you were giving advice, it would not be that we go to the extremes, because we've had some, I think, fairly aggressively progressive, let me put it as positively as possible, proposals out there that would cost a lot of money, which also you would know about having been on the Senate Finance Committee. So if you were advising the Democratic Party, you would think run more toward the center.
That's my view. I think that's ultimately what's going to prevail. Now, I'm a little older. So someone might ask, so maybe I'm not sufficiently in touch. Yeah. But I'm trying to analyze the best I can, and that's what I would suggest.